Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So, so as you just heard, I'm from the linguistics department, and my research is on second language acquisition, but I myself am not a native speaker of English. I grew up speaking French in Quebec, Canada. Both my parents are French speakers, and I didn't start learning English until I was 9, but I was 2 hours a week until I was 16, and after that, until I was 16, and then when I moved to Ottawa in Canada to do my undergrad degrees, and there I started learning English, or using English on a regular basis, but I was 19 years old by then. Okay? So, yeah, it's possible to be successful at learning a second language. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Namely, the question I'll be asking is there a critical period for learning a second or foreign language?
Just really quickly, does she sound like a native speaker to you? Yeah, me too. Okay. So you did well.
Thank you. I do make mistakes. Maybe you can get bonus points if you catch a few. Okay, so is there a critical period for learning a second or foreign language? Well, we know that there is such a thing as critical period in biology, right? So a critical period is a period of heightened sensitivity during which exposure to environmental stimuli is crucial for some ability to function or develop normally. Can you think of an example with animals, for example? Can you think of a particular case where there might be a critical period with animals?
A panda?
Panda.
What would the critical period be? What's something
Birds.
that they learn?
Thank you. What about birds? Good.
That's a bird.
What do birds learn?
Song.
Songs.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. So if a bird is not exposed to the the type of songs that that bird family sings, then the bird is not going to learn to sing that song. There's a critical period for that. Other examples, there's a critical period for orientation specificity in the visual cortex for cats. These experiments, I hope no one does them anymore, but essentially if you blindfold a cat, or I guess it was even worse what they did, I'm not going to mention it, the cat loses its ability to see properly.
It was the 60s.
It was, yeah. Imprinting in chicks or ducklings. If a little baby chick sees you before he or she sees his or her mother, he's going to think that you're the parent. Okay, so at a very young age, chicks think that the first animal they see is the parent. And there's a critical period for that, and for that bonding. Okay, and song learning with certain birds. Okay, so these are examples of critical periods for animals. Now, what about language acquisition? Well, the idea of a critical period for language acquisition was first proposed by Penfield and Roberts and by Lenneberg. And the idea is that the primary acquisition of language is predicated upon a certain developmental stage, which is quickly outgrown at the age of puberty. So the idea was that at the time, they thought that if there is a critical period, it's between birth and the onset of puberty, roughly. You have to learn the second or foreign language during that time period. After that, it's too late. That was the initial proposal. Okay? We'll see evidence. Don't get discouraged yet. We'll see evidence that this may not be correct. But this is how this hypothesis was first formulated. And it was based on evidence from children who had not been exposed to a first language. Okay? And it was also based on evidence from child and adult patients with aphasia. Do you know what aphasia is?
No.
It's a language deficit that takes place following damage to the brain. So for example, strokes. If people have strokes in their brain, like a blood vessel burst in the brain, and depending on the location where it happens, it can create language impairment. And the critical point here is that kids are a lot better at recovering from aphasia than adults are. It's much more difficult for adults to relearn to speak and understand the language than it is for kids. So it was based on evidence like this that they proposed the critical period hypothesis. And the critical component of the critical period hypothesis is that it's caused by neurological changes in the brain. And so the child's brain matures or changes from birth to about the onset of puberty. And this is what they thought caused the critical period. Let me read a quote. The termination of the critical period seems to be related to a loss of adaptability and inability for reorganization in the brain, particularly with respect to the topographical extent of neurophysiological processes. The limitations in man may well be connected with the peculiar phenomenon of cerebral lateralization of function. It's okay if you don't understand this whole quote. The idea being important neurological changes happen in the brain and affect the plasticity of the brain and how easily the brain can change and learn information during that early time period when the child grows up. Okay? And this is more or less what we expect if there is a critical period for learning a language. We expect something like this. So on the x-axis, we have age, and particularly what we mean is age of acquisition, or when you first learn the language. On the y-axis, we have the level that is attained, meaning how good or how proficient someone becomes in the language. So if there is a critical period, what you might expect is something like this. Up until the onset of puberty, you can learn a language. It's possible. That ability starts declining right before the beginning of puberty. And after the onset of puberty, then you can't anymore. That's what the traditional critical period hypothesis would predict. Okay? And what is important here is that the critical period is directly linked to neurological maturation that takes place from birth to the time when the child's brain is assumed to function similarly to the adult's brain. That's the critical part. It's the neurological changes in the brain that are assumed to cause the limitations in language learning. Okay. There is an alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is that there is no critical period, just an overall general age effect, which means that as age of acquisition increases, proficiency in the second language is not as good, or it's more difficult to become more proficient in the second language. Okay? But this isn't a critical period anymore, because this decline is over time. So it doesn't matter if the onset of puberty is here, it's just a general decline over time in the ability to learn a language. This decrease in attainment with age of acquisition is attributed to both a general cognitive decline, okay, that happens with age. As you know, as we get older, we're not as good remembering information anymore, etc., etc. That decline begins very early on. It begins at the age of 20 and it slowly goes down. That's the first factor that's responsible for that. The second one is experiential variables. Variables having to do with your experience. Okay, and here it's the experience of learning and using your first language. And so the later you learn a second language, the longer you've used your first language, the stronger the connections are in your brain between particular concepts and the first language words that you know. And so this has to do with the experience that the person has with his or her first language. Okay? So both this general decline and this experience will contribute to a gradual decrease in the ability to learn language over the entire lifetime. Okay? Do you have any questions so far about the two hypotheses? So go ahead.
So from what the age start, from the birth to what is the age that is expected to finish the critical period at?
Unfortunately, researchers don't agree on that. And so the age I will give you is from 11 to 16. But that's because the researchers have used different criteria to establish the cutoff point. Nowadays, people think it's more like 10 to 12. Okay? But in the research I will show you now, the cutoff points that was chosen ranged from 11 to 16. Other questions so far? This was an excellent question, thank you. Before we begin, let me go over some terminology that I will be using in this presentation. First, CPH, I won't say it, but you'll see in the slides. It means critical period hypothesis. I'll use the acronym L2 a lot. L2 means second or foreign language. It could be third language, fourth language, it doesn't matter. It just means not the first language. Okay. L1 means the native or the first language. Now, I'll talk about two types of L2 learners, the early learners. And what it means is exactly in answer to your question, they began learning the L2 at an early age. And the early age being less than 11 to 16. And again, this is because the researchers have used different criteria. I think it's between 10 and 12. But I'll go with 11 to 16 here for showing the research. Okay? And then the second group of learners are the late learners. Those who began learning the language at a later age. And by later, we mean later than 11 to 16. The last acronym you'll see in these slides is AOA. AOA stands for age of arrival. And here what it means is age of arrival in the country where the L2 is spoken. So I'll be talking about a lot of L2 learners who've moved to the US from different countries. And so then we're talking about the age of arrival to the US. Okay, so these acronyms will come back. So what do we do when we have a theory? We want to test that theory, right? We want to see whether that theory makes correct predictions, and we want to see whether that theory can be falsified, whether we can prove it wrong. That's very important in research. And this is precisely what we're going to try to do here. We're going to try to look for evidence to falsify the critical period hypothesis. Now, what kind of evidence can falsify the critical period hypothesis? Number one, if we find a relationship between linguistic knowledge and age of arrival in the L2 environment for both early and late learners, then perhaps we can falsify the critical period hypothesis. Let me illustrate why. This is the critical period hypothesis, right? So there's a decline for early learners. There's a relationship between how good they are and how old they started learning the language. But for the late learners, there's nothing. There's no relationship. They're all bad. Therefore, the critical period hypothesis predicts a relationship between age of arrival, or age of acquisition, and the level attained only for the early learners, not for the late learners. On the other hand, the no critical period hypothesis, we predict a relationship for both early and late learners. A relationship between age of acquisition or age of arrival and how good they are on linguistic tasks, not just for early learners, but also for late learners. So if we find that, then we can falsify the critical period hypothesis. However, there is one thing to keep in mind with that, which is there are a lot of variables confounded with age of arrival. And so the earlier that someone has started learning a language, the longer they've been in that country as well. And so length of residence tends to be confounded with age of arrival. And we need to deconfound that. We need to make sure that what we are attributing to age of arrival is not due to length of residence. That's the first thing. The second thing, the studies don't really do that, but age of arrival also tends to be correlated with how much each person uses the second language. The people who arrive later in the country tend to use the second language less on a regular basis. Okay? So we'll have to keep that in mind when we go over the studies. Okay, so that's the first way to falsify the critical period. The second way is to show that some L2 learners can perform similarly to native speakers on linguistic tasks. So if we find second language learners whose performance is similar to native speakers, then potentially we have an argument, a second argument, to falsify the critical period. The third argument has to do with neurological measures of processes that take place in the brain. If we measure these processes, and if we find that the late learners perform just like native speakers when their neurological processes are measured, then we have a third argument against the critical period. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now we'll look at studies that have tried to falsify the critical period, or falsify or test the critical period using each of these arguments. We'll begin with the first one, the relationship between linguistic knowledge and age of arrival for both early and late learners. One of the very early studies that investigated this question, but also one of the important ones, is Johnson and Newport, 1989. What they did was they tested Korean and Chinese learners of English who had arrived to the US at various ages. Okay? And what the participants did was an oral grammaticality judgment task. Oral means they heard sentences. Okay, the sentences were presented auditorily. Okay? Grammaticality judgment task, what they did was they heard the sentence, and then they had to decide whether this sentence sounds correct in English. Is this sentence grammatical in English or not? And here are examples of the sentences that they heard. What's wrong with the first sentence?
Yes.
Pigs, or missing the plural s. With the second one? Should be shot. Past tense. Third? A book. Potentially books. But probably you just read one book at a time in the bathtub. And the fourth one? For us. Okay. There were 12 types of violations, of errors like that. And the participants were asked to decide whether this sounds okay in English or not. Okay? And here are the results that they found. I'm sorry, the font size is small for a reason, which I'll explain in a minute. We have age of arrival. We have age of arrival on the x-axis. Okay? We have the test score on the y-axis. This is for the people that they categorized early learners, because the cutoff point they chose was at 16. So what we find is a linear relationship, very strong, 0.87, negative relationship between age of arrival and the test score for the early learners. Okay? You know what a correlation is? And so here we find a negative correlation, which means that age of arrival is directly related or is a good predictor of the test scores. The higher the age of arrival, the lower the test scores. Okay? These are the late learners. Age of arrival from 16 to 40. The graph is bigger because, look, this is 215 right here, and 210 is right here. Okay, so I try to put them on the same scale so that you can compare. So performance was a lot worse. Okay? But what we see here is that there is no relationship because the correlation is only 0.16 negative. And if we look at the dots, we see that there is not a clear relationship. Age of arrival does not seem to be a good predictor of performance for the late learners.
Yeah.
So what do you think they said in relation to the critical period hypothesis? Do you think they supported the hypothesis or not?
For the later arrival, I don't think they support it.
But the late arrivals don't show a relationship.
But there is, but small. as you say, this is just 16.
Mm-hmm. So remember that the critical period hypothesis predicts a relationship between age of arrival and the scores only for the early learners. So this is in line with the critical period because there's no relationship for the late learners. Okay. So they said, okay, yes, there is a critical period. That's for that reason. However, there are a number of limitations for their study. One of them is that there's a potential correlation between age of acquisition and use of English and how good they were in English. Okay, they did not control for that. In terms of length of residence, they were also correlated. They were also intertwined and confounded, but with some special statistical measures, they were able to show that actually age of arrival is still a predictor, even if we explain the variability due to length of residence. Another limitation is that if the cutoff point was instead 20 years instead of 16, if they selected a different cutoff point for the critical period, then all of a sudden they had a big correlation for the late learners. Okay? All of a sudden, this would predict a relationship between age of acquisition and scores for the late learners as well if they change the cutoff point, if they change the time at which the critical period ends from 16 to 20. Now, no one thinks the critical period ends at 20 years old. Okay? But this is just an argument saying that it's not true that there was no linear relationship at all in the adult data. Okay? And finally, the difference between their early and late learners could have been due to the different educational backgrounds. Early learners were educated in the US, late learners were educated in China and Korea. Potentially this can affect the results, especially given the nature of the task, right? So they're asked to judge whether or not a sentence is correct. If you are taught English as a second language, you're taught grammar rules. Maybe you can use this explicit knowledge about the grammar rules to answer the task. Maybe that does not reflect well enough how good you are in English. Okay, so these are arguments that have been raised against that study. Fortunately, there have been many other studies since then. One of them is Birdsong and Mullis. They replicated Johnson and Newport, okay? Except that they did that with Spanish learners of English instead of Korean and Chinese. The rest of the task was identical. Okay? And they also did a grammaticality judgment task that was oral. The participants heard the sentences. They were exactly the same sentences as before. And here's what they find, okay? The black dots are the Johnson and Newport results. The previous results are the black dots. The white dots, the empty ones, are the new results from the Spanish learners. What do we find? If we look at this line here, these are the early learners. Okay? They're much better. And there's no relationship anymore. Their performance does not decrease with age of arrival. And this time, it's the late learners who show a decline.
Sorry, Annie, did you eliminate some stuff?
Yeah.
Did you eliminate some things?
Yeah, I moved things around.
Okay.
That's why I sent you the new slides.
Oh, I didn't get them.
Yeah, it's number 9.
I didn't get them.
Yeah.
Page number 9.
This is 26, isn't it?
I'm sorry.
That's
I
okay.
sent you the new slides, like at 11.
Oh, shoot. Oh, well. Page 26.
Yes, I try to make things smoother.
That's cool.
I'm sorry about that. So the order is not, it's pretty close, but there are a few changes. So the critical point here is that there is a relationship with age, with the late learners. So this is different from the Johnson and Newport, right? Because they didn't have a relationship. And they did correlations as well to examine these relationships. And what they found is for the late learners, there is a strong relationship that's negative, okay, and significant. And for their results, age of arrival was not correlated with length of residence. So how early they moved to the U.S. did not necessarily match how long they had been in the U.S., at least for this group. Okay. Is this for or against a critical period? Remember, the argument for a critical period is that the late group should not show a relationship with age of arrival. And they do here. Okay? So it seems to be evidence against the critical period. Now let's move on to another study. Bialystok and Miller. They tested both Spanish and Chinese L2 learners of English. And they did a grammatical judgment task, just like the other ones, except that the sentences were both presented auditorily and in written form. And the sentences were thought to be equally, so they didn't use exactly the same sentences as Johnson and Newport. They made changes, but they picked sentences that they thought would be equally difficult for Spanish and Chinese speakers.
Sorry guys, so this is back on page 6. Okay.
Okay, and here are the results. Essentially, what we see again is an age decline, a performance decline with age. Okay, and the Chinese performing worse than the Spanish learners. And so for the Chinese, there seems to be a bigger break right here.
Yeah.
But for the Spanish, it seems gradual.
Maybe because the equation, the location, they're near, they are not far, so far, so there is something common in the language.
Potentially, that can be a reason. I think they might have tested some speakers from Spain as well. They were not necessarily Latin American only. I think they had both in their participants. But that could potentially be a factor. Another one, we'll talk about it in a second, is Spanish is a lot more similar to English than Chinese is. So if we look at the correlations that they did, the early group and the late group had both the scores that they obtained correlated with their age of arrival, and it was significant for both groups. Same for Spanish. It's a little bit smaller among the late learners because they show more variability, but they correlate in both cases. So, and in this case, age of arrival correlated with length of residence, but only for the early learners, not for the late learners. So the correlation that we find for the late learners cannot be explained by length of residence. So what do we conclude from these pieces of evidence? Actually, before that, I think I forgot to change the heading of this slide. How does Bialystok and Miller interpret the effect of the first language on these results? So the Chinese speakers, like we saw, performed less well than the Spanish speakers. We talked about that. The proximity of the two languages is an important factor. But they don't think this is an argument against the lack of critical period. They don't think it's an argument for the critical period. Here's what they say. The mechanism for human language learning in childhood is indifferent to which language a child attempts to learn. So efforts at language learning should be equally effective in acquiring any language. So it shouldn't matter which language you're learning. If there is a critical period, it should apply for any language. That's what this is saying. Okay? The fact that the younger Spanish learners appear to be privileged in learning English, but the younger Chinese learners were not, rules against an interpretation that is based in biology. So they don't think that the advantage, obviously, if you find an advantage for one language group but not the other, biology can't be responsible for that. Okay? Instead, the systematic differences between language groups points to the role of more experiential and language-related factors in determining the outcomes of learning at all ages of second language acquisition. So they think it's your experience with your first language that determines the extent to which the ability declines over time. Meaning the longer you use your native language, and the longer you've used your native language, and the more different it is from English, for example, the more difficult it becomes to learn English. That's how they interpret these results. And that quote is not in your slides. Feel free to share the PowerPoint, the original.
I don't have it, so if you could resend it when you get back to your office, and then I'll just post it for them.
Okay, this is really strange. I wonder what
I don't
happened.
know. Maybe because it was a big file. Sometimes the KU servers hiccup and won't send it.
Okay. Now, there is one more study to talk about, which is Flaggy, Yanni, Komshin, and Liu. And unlike the other two studies, what they also looked at is pronunciation. Okay? How does age of arrival affect how good your pronunciation is in a second language? And so they tested Korean learners of English with an oral grammaticality judgment task. So again, auditory sentences. That's not pronunciation. That was one of the two experiments. The other experiment was productions. So they asked the participants to read sentences, and they recorded them. And then they asked native speakers of English to listen to these sentences and decide how much of a foreign accent they hear on a scale from 1 to 9.
Did everyone find the slide on page 7?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the number 9, the higher the rating, the smaller the accent, the better the performance, in other words. And here's what they find. For the grammaticality judgment task, the results are somewhat similar to those of the previous studies. But for the accent rating, the results are very strong. The older the age of arrival, the stronger the accent. The worse the performance, the stronger the accent. So they've interpreted that, again, you have a clear linear difference, that must be evidence against the critical period, because that linear difference, that linear relationship takes place for the late learners. Okay? And that's what we find right here, point 50. In their grammaticality task, it's not as strong, it's a lot weaker. But in their accent rating task, it's a lot stronger. So the later these people have arrived to the US, actually, yeah, it was the US, this one, because he has studies in Canada as well. I think it was the US. Yes, it's written right there. The later they had arrived in the US, the stronger the accent. Okay. So to come back to my conclusion, there is no evidence of clear discontinuity between early and late learners. It's just a general decline. They don't seem to show a clear discontinuity. Okay. In other words, there is a relationship between age of arrival and performance even for the late learners. The decline in performance that we observe in the data may be cognitive in nature, but it's unlikely to be maturational. It's unlikely to have to do with the maturation that the child goes through during the first 12 to 15 years of life. Any questions about that? So that's the first conclusion. Now the second conclusion, how can we falsify the critical period hypothesis? Can we find late learners who perform similarly to native speakers on various linguistic tasks? Let's look back at some of the results that we've already seen. Are there exceptions here? Are there people who can perform just as good as native speakers? In this graph, there's one person. Okay? Among the late learners, there's only one speaker.
An outlier.
An outlier, exactly. Who performs as good as native speakers on this. One exception. In the Birdsong and Mollis study, one person among the late learners who perform like native speakers. Here's another study that shows some information on this. McDonald. That's in a different order. So she tested Spanish and Vietnamese learners of English, also using a similar grammaticality judgment task. similar again to the first study. And here are her results. Now, we have two different groups here with two different performances.
So we're on page 12 now. Page 12.
And what she finds is essentially 5 speakers. So these are the native speakers are right here. Okay? The 0 line means 0 age, means it's a native speaker. Because he or she they learned English from birth. Okay? So these are the native speakers, and these are the 5 late learners who perform in the same range as native speakers. So this study is more encouraging, right?
That should give you hope. You could be an outlier.
Now, if we look at this study that we've already seen, are there exceptions, people who perform like native speakers? Not in the accent, unfortunately, but there are a few in the grammaticality judgment task. So it seems that having a close to native-like accent is difficult, more difficult than grammar. Another study, Moyer, she tested learners of German, and she also looked at how much of an accent they had in German. Okay? This time, the scale is the opposite. This time, 1 means native, means good, like a native speaker, and 6 means non-native. Okay? And here's what she finds. She finds 1 exception. So here the relationship is in the opposite direction, okay? Because 6 is really strong accent. And 1 is not much of an accent, just like native speakers. Okay, so the higher, the worst. That's why the line goes in the opposite direction. And here's the exception. The 1 person whose accent in German is very, very good. Okay?
I have a question. In this study, does she profile that person, that exception? Does she give us any more information about them?
She doesn't focus on that person.
I want to know about those outliers. Like, what did they do differently?
No, I think she might.
I'll read it. I'll look it up.
Yeah, I can't remember. I know there's a few studies that those outliers, they talk about them and they're like simultaneous interpreters or they teach or they're oftentimes these exceptions work in language-related fields.
Right, there's something about them that's,
But I don't remember for this, if it's this one or another one. So the last study that I'll talk about for this is Birdsong. He looked at English learners of French who had lived in a French environment or in France for at least 3 years. And he also looked at the accents that these people had in French. He analyzed their speech acoustically, and he also had their accent evaluated. Okay? And he found that 2 people were like native speakers out of 22. So there were 2 English learners of French who were deemed to be just as good in their pronunciation as native speakers of French are. So it appears possible for a few select late learners to perform within the range of native speakers in both grammar and pronunciation. But it's certainly the exception, not the rule. But it's possible. Okay. However, a few things to keep in mind. Most near-native late learners speak a target language that's topologically related to the native language. Grammaticality judgment task may not be sufficient to assess the linguistic knowledge. So some people have raised this as concerns, that grammaticality judgment task may not be a good way to test this. And learners may just need to be tested on a variety of tasks, not just 1 or 2. Okay? So some people have essentially cast some doubt on whether you can use these exceptions and treat them to falsify the critical period hypothesis. Some people don't believe these exceptions falsify the critical period hypothesis. They believe that the problem is the task. Not comprehensive enough or too easy or testing explicit grammatical knowledge taught in the classroom, etc., etc. Okay. Last thing. Do I have time?
Okay, I have plenty of time.
Okay.
We're here until 4:50, so
I-
4:40.
I do have to
Oh, you have to leave? Okay.
by 4 for another class. Okay, so the last thing that we need to talk about is, okay, so we saw that it's very rare. So it can happen for second language learners to pattern like native speakers, but it's not the rule, not really. But what if we look at neurological measures that take place in the brain? What might we find then? So the brain contains, so that's the new stuff, the brain contains neurons. This isn't in your handout.
But we looked at this before because we studied about spicy food and the effects on the brain. So you've seen pictures like this before, right? The spicy food goes to the very ends, the transmitters, and it tricks your brain into thinking that it's hot, it's on fire.
So this is a picture that illustrates how the information travels in the neurons, the directionality and whatnot. But the important part for the method I'll talk about is that the brain, these neurons are electrically excitable.
Excitable, yeah.
Thank you. See, I don't always know how to pronounce things in English. Electrically excitable cells that transmit information to one another. Okay, and that electricity can be measured. Okay, when they fire, neurons generate electricity that can be measured to investigate language processing. And so this is the method I'll talk about now, how we can measure electricity on the scalp to measure language processing. And this is done this way. We have the participant wearing a special kind of cap, and on the cap there are electrodes. Okay, and each electrode sends a signal to a machine. It's first amplified because it's too small. It's amplified, and then we measure this electricity, we amplify it and we measure it as the participant hears or sees language. Okay. Sees orthographically language, orthographically on the screen, or hears it. And so this electrical activity is recorded via electroencephalography. Okay. It's time-locked to the onset of a written or auditory stimulus. So the critical word that is incorrect, for example, we measure the electric signal right at the beginning of that word, as the person reads or hears the word. Okay? And we average it across many, many, many test items. And then we have what we call an event-related potential. Okay? And that event-related potential can tell us how the person is processing the word. Okay? And what we do is we have an experimental condition, and we compare it to a control condition. And the experimental condition is a word, for example, that has an error. And the control condition is the correct word. And we look at the difference in the electricity that's the neurons, when the neurons fire, when the person processes that word. Excuse me. Okay. So there are two kinds of effects that have been reported in the literature with native speakers. The first one we call N400. Okay? It's called N400 because it's negative and it occurs at 400 milliseconds. Now, this is what the effect looks like. The x-axis is time in milliseconds. The y-axis is amplitude, but the negative amplitude is plotted upward, unlike how we normally plot data. So negative is up, okay? Positive is down. And this happens when we have an error like this one. Whipped cream tastes sweet. Is that correct? Yeah, it can taste sweet, right? Whipped cream can be sweet. Whipped cream tastes anxious. Does that work? Not really. Okay, whipped cream don't taste like a feeling. Okay, so here we have an error, a vocabulary error, if you wish. The sentence doesn't make sense. And this is the error that it generates. The error, the blue line, is negative, and it peaks at about 400 milliseconds. And when we measure it on the head, it's at the back, on the top at the back of the head. And the blue means it's negative. Okay? So it has a negative polarity. It takes place at 400 milliseconds. And this is the important part. This is the effect that we find with native speakers when they hear or see or read a vocabulary error. If there's an error in the word, if it's the wrong word that's there, and the sentence doesn't make sense, we find this type of effect. And we call it the N400. Okay? You'll understand in a few minutes why I'm explaining this. The other kind of effect that's important is what we call the P600. P6, what do you think P means? Positive, exactly. So we have that same graph, time in milliseconds, amplitude, and then now, remember, negatives up, positives down. The red line is more positive than the black line. Okay? And 600, what do you think that means? Milliseconds. Exactly. So it's the time when it happens. 600 milliseconds after the beginning of the critical word. Now, what creates these errors? Look at these sentences. The spoiled child throws the toy versus the spoiled child throw the toy. Is this the same type of error as in the previous sentence?
No.
No. This is a grammatical error. It's not a vocabulary error. Okay? And this generates an effect that looks completely different. Okay? It has positive polarity. It takes place at 600 milliseconds. And grammatical errors elicited. And it's recorded in a similar location on the head. But the polarity is different. And the nature of the effect is different. Now this is for native speakers. The question that's being asked in research is, how do second language learners treat these errors? Do they treat them also as grammatical errors? Now imagine that the second language learner does not know that there is a grammatical rule in English, and you add an S to the verb when it's third person singular. Imagine the person doesn't know that. You think that person would get that kind of error? No. What if the person thinks there are two words in English, throw and throws? There's no grammatical rule. Imagine you just have two completely different words. What kind of effect might the person have? Maybe the person will have an effect like this, the N400. Because if you have two different words, throw and throws, you don't have a grammatical rule anymore. It becomes almost like a vocabulary error, because you're just putting the wrong word there. Okay? So this is why they've asked this research question. This is why they've used this. The polarity of the effect can tell us whether they treat the error as a vocabulary error or whether they treat the error as a grammatical error. Okay? So many studies have looked at this. This is just one of them. They looked at first-year late learners of French who spoke English as their native language. They were tested at 1 month, 4 months, and 8 months of French instruction. Okay, so it was a longitudinal study. And they read sentences that contained grammatical errors in French. And the errors were like those in English, throws, but they were French errors. Okay? An example, tu adores versus tu adorer. Here it's the wrong conjugation for the verb. Okay, it's just a wrong grammatical rule. And they recorded the event-related potentials as the participants read these on the screen. Now, will they show an N400 or a P600? After 1 month, they show an N400. As if they're treating the error as if it's a vocabulary error. That's what it means, because the N400 in native speakers is for vocabulary errors. So this suggests that they have stored these two forms separately, as if they're two different words. Adore and adorer, they're treating them as completely different words. That's what it means. But as they get more instruction, look, they're starting to be just like native speakers. Okay? Because native speakers generate this effect for grammatical rules, and after only 8 months of being taught French, they're able to do that. That's good news, isn't it? Only 8 months. And so this has been interpreted as evidence that even if second language learners behave differently in behavioral tasks. They behave differently in grammaticality judgment tasks, in pronunciation tasks, etc. The processes that take place in the brain are the same in nature. That's what this has been interpreted as. So this has been found in many, many studies, not just this one. And this suggests that late learners can show similar ERP components as native speakers, suggesting that the processes in the brain are very similar to those of native speakers. Is this evidence against or for the critical period? Against. So it seems, excuse me, it seems that we have evidence against the critical period, at least in 1 and 3. Okay? Strong evidence in 1 and in 3. In 2, some people, like I said, have claimed the tasks were too easy when people were able to perform like native speakers. So 2 is less certain, but 1 and 3, for sure, there's evidence against the critical period. Now, how do we interpret these age effects? What is it that causes the decline over time? Because there is a decline, there's no denying that. One possible explanation is that there's a general decline in cognitive resources and in brain volume. So the brain shrinks with age, not much, but enough that it's statistically significant. And cognitive function decays over time. And so this has been interpreted as a potential explanation for why it's harder to learn a language as you get older. And working memory is part of that decline. Okay, so do you know what working memory is? So it's the idea that if you're holding, it's the ability to hold words in short-term memory, or information, excuse me, in short-term memory while you do something else. Okay, so if you're hearing, what was the example you gave this morning?
Listening to a lecture and taking notes at the same time.
Thank you. It's a good example.
It's very difficult to do, right?
Yeah. So it's the ability to tune to two different things, or to hold particular information in memory and storage while you do something else. Okay? So this declines over time with age. Working memory declines. At my age, at 40, 50, it declines from 20 to 70. It declines nonstop. Okay?
So it's even more difficult if you're reading the slides and listening and writing. That takes
the slides
even
don't match.
but that takes even more working memory.
So this general decrease in working memory with age has been claimed to be a factor explaining why there is a general decline with age. And this is true not just for language, right? When you get older, it's a lot harder to learn a lot of things, but language is just one of them. Okay? And finally, experiential variables such as the increasing use and entrenchment of the native language with age. So the longer you've been speaking your first language, the stronger the connections are, the more difficult it is to start using a second language, to produce it. This has been another explanation. We can't tease these two things apart. Okay? It's very hard to tease them apart, because that cognitive decline tends to match also the increasing use of using your first language, etc., etc. And that's it. Are there any questions? I apologize again for the slides. I understand it must have been difficult to follow. Are there any questions?
Are there any questions about language learning in general or bilingualism?
So how many factors there are for the learning, for like the environment and the age?
There are many, many, many factors. The important ones are definitely how young you are or how old you are when you begin learning the language. That's one factor. And how long you've lived in the environment. So we've talked about these two. And how much you use the language. Are you fully immersed? So is it the case that while you're in the US, you hang out with American people, or do you not? And if you don't, then obviously you don't use the language as much, right? So opportunities to use, to listen and speak. These are three of the strongest factors. There are other factors. One of them is motivation, but it's a lot weaker. And it's correlated with other things, right? So the learners who are very, very motivated, they also use the language more. So it's hard sometimes to tease some of these things apart. Confidence, to some extent, but again, it's correlated as well with use of the language. So generally speaking, use, residence, and age, these three things can encompass a lot of the variability. Memory is also one factor, especially working memory, but it's not as strong of a predictor either.
How about biological factor and the cultural factor?
Biological factor.
Yeah.
So, you mean the kinds of changes that take place in the brain?
Yeah. So when you compare the Chinese and the Spanish, because the Europe, that's the Europe, that is Asia, people have different structure of the mouth, of the tongues, of the throat,
Oh.
of gene, of brain, and all these are biological factors.
You mean people's vocal? It's interesting. I don't think research in linguistics shows that it matters. Not in the first language.
Yeah.
That even if your body's different, you're going to use the articulators that you have, and it will still produce speech. So I think it's a very interesting question, but I don't think it's been shown to affect, at least for the pronunciation. For the brain, I mean, there is obviously, so, but it would predict the opposite, right? So Asian speakers in Asia, there's a lot more pressure, I think, for academic performance to be very strong, and in universities it's very, very competitive, and courses are, I think, harder than the US. But if you thought that this was a factor, then you would predict that the people in Asia would be better. But we saw that it's really not the case. Not because they're not good, but because the language is more different. So it seems to really be, I'm sorry, when you said factor, that's the other factor I forgot to mention, the native language. It seems that the native language plays a huge role in determining how proficient a person becomes. There's another factor I haven't talked about. It's called language aptitude. So there is people who investigate the concept of language learning aptitude. Some people are better than others at learning languages. And some of it has to do with perceptual acuity, like how well you can pay attention to fine details in speech.
Noticing. We've talked about noticing in this class.
That's one example. Another one is pattern recognition for grammar, for example. Be able to recognize abstract patterns. So there are some skills like this that have been linked to language learning as well. And this, with the idea that the stronger you are at those skills, the better you are at language learning. So.
Daniel, I have a question for you. Do you think that there's a difference between a Chinese person's ability to learn the language because of something about their mouth or their vocal cords? So you were born in China, so you're better able to learn Chinese because you're ethnically Chinese?
Yeah.
But there's Chinese people born in America.
Right.
Okay.
So
And they learn how to speak English just like me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that this doesn't really work in that sense. Yeah. I mean, it's the case that, biologically it will be true that, they have different bodies, size of head, size of, articulators, that will be different. But people can learn a language even with that variability. Even in the US, there's that variability. There are smaller people, bigger people. So that shouldn't affect, it's a good question, right? But it shouldn't affect the ability to learn a language. So people have this special mechanism that allow them to abstract away from that. When you hear speech, it doesn't matter. Those fine-grained differences don't matter anymore. You're able to tune all of that out when you hear someone else speak. Even if they're physically different from you, you're able to tune that out. So the same is true in a second language. Arguably, it could be harder, but... Other questions?
After you left in the morning class, we had a little discussion about, I segued it into a discussion about the theory of critical periods. And some people believe that there's different critical periods and different aspects of language acquisition that disappear over time. And the first one to go is phonology, the ability to acquire sounds. Because you learn, starting when you're in utero, actually, you start learning the sounds of your native language, the vowels and the consonants, and the R's and the L's, and all the sounds of your language. And that is the first aspect of language acquisition to die, which is why people who start learning late in life, this is the theory, why people who start learning late in life will always speak with an accent. They will never sound like a native speaker because they don't have that ability. But there's also different periods.
Yeah, it's been clean, and we've seen the results, right? That the grammar part seems to be less of a problem than the pronunciation. There's fewer exceptions in the pronunciation. Some people have claimed actually that the critical period is like 1. Basically, babies, infants, get tuned to the language that they first hear, and the moment that they become used to that language, which is around between the age of 8 months and 12 months. By then they can no longer, so an infant, a baby, can perceive any sound in any language. So you ask a baby to suck a special pacifier, and you look at how often it sucks it, and you use that as a method to decide whether the baby can tell the difference between 2 different sounds. And essentially you have an habituation phase, the baby gets used to hearing something, and then you change the sound. And if the baby recognizes that there's a difference, he or she will start sucking faster on the pacifier. So it's been used with infants to decide whether they can hear differences between sounds, between languages, etc. And the consensus is that they can up until I can't remember the exact period of time. I think it's between 6 months, up until 6 months they can hear any difference between any language. And after that, it starts decreasing, and I think by 12 months, nothing. It's just the native language. The baby cannot perceive differences between sounds that are not realized in the native language anymore. So some people have said, well, the critical period for phonology is really at that time. But
6 months.
right. But there's another thing to do with accents that has little to do with the linguistic knowledge. It has to do with motor skills, just articulation. And if you have some articulatory movements that are really entrenched because you've used them all your life or so many years to produce your native language, then it's really hard to start changing that. It's like learning to ride a bicycle or learning to play an instrument where you have muscle memory. These things become a lot harder as you get older. Language is similar in that sense, and it may not reflect your knowledge in a case like this. It may just reflect something that's mostly motor related. In some cases it may reflect the knowledge, but not necessarily all the time.
How many of you have problem with the TH sound? Ryan?
Yeah.
He came to my office last week and we worked on it. And he would say 3. And then he would read a sentence and he would say, I have 3 sisters. Or 3. Yeah. So he could do it. He could do it if I asked him to. But he couldn't do it naturally in speaking. And this is very normal. It's a lot of people are that way.
Just a practice. I have that experience.
You've had that experience?
Yeah.
And you practiced a lot?
Yeah.
And it's better now?
Yeah, just practice.
I think that also has to do with self-consciousness. Like if you're embarrassed to do it because it feels strange, then you won't do it. What was the most difficult sound of English for you when you were learning?
Stress.
Oh, the syllable stress.
Yeah.
Construct and construct.
French, we don't have stress in French. My dissertation research was on French learners of English learning stress.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I always had trouble. Forever, I kept saying consent form instead of consent form. It took me 2 years to correct it. After using that all the time in my work, I didn't know it was wrong. So I often misstress words. I stress around syllable. I mean, I've gotten a lot better at it, but I still occasionally do. So. But yeah, TH is a sound we don't have in French. in France, they pronounce it as S, I think. But in Quebec, we pronounce it as T.
Mm.
So,
It depends. The voiced TH, the ev, is usually a Z, pronounced like a Z.
in France, yeah, but
Yeah.
Quebec we pronounce it as a D.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we have the same language, but different dialects, and we pronounce things slightly differently.
Yeah, I have French family, and they,
Okay.
they use the Z.
I have another question.
Yes.
Why do you find that Chinese students are much better in reading and writing? And you find Arabic students much better at speaking this? I'm wondering why.
First of all, have you noticed this? Have you studied this?
I haven't studied this, I have noticed this, and there's a very easy explanation. I don't know about Arabic speakers, but I know for generally East Asian students, in their native country, there's a lot more emphasis on reading and writing. That's as easy an explanation as that. So there's not, am I correct? So when you learned English in China, for example, there's a lot, the focus was usually on reading and writing and not so much on speaking. So there's no opportunity to hear or speak the language. And so I don't know in Arabic, in Arabic-speaking countries whether it's the opposite. But definitely I know I lived in Hawaii and taught in Hawaii, and so I know East Asian students, that's typically the case. And we did some research with Korean learners of French, and in Korea, and they're hard to find. And same issue, not enough focus on oral French. So.
Yeah, this is definitely an issue of the culture of the country that you come from. And East Asia is very much, all of the countries are very much a culture of reading and writing. And Middle Eastern culture is an oral tradition, right? You talk a lot. You don't read as much. I think that every year in the entire Middle East, there are like 1% of the books published as are published in the United States alone. It's just not a big, the culture isn't so much about reading and writing. It's more about, storytelling in the oral tradition. So I think that plays into it as well. But also, yeah, all of their tests that they're required to take, reading and writing. Reading and writing.
Good question. I have to run.
Well, thank you very much.